Hello, my name is Steve Baule, and as I told a group of K-12 administrators a couple of days ago, basically I'm on a 12-step recovery plan from having been a superintendent. Uh, I worked at I work currently at Winona State University, where I actually manage the doctoral program and teach aspiring principals and superintendents for their licensing. A little bit about me, my background. I originally started out as a history teacher, and then I was a library media specialist briefly in St. Charles, Illinois, suburban Chicago. Worked in the suburban Chicago area as a high school principal, assistant principal. I served 6 years at New Trier High School as the assistant superintendent for information technology, and then served about 15 years as a K-12 superintendent in a couple of different districts. I always say that I was basically a janitor. I just came to clean up other people's messes, which sadly more accurate than I would want to admit. And then since 2018, I've worked in higher education. So I guess that's 7 years now, which is it's a long time for me. Uh, and I think a lot of this use of data, and people talk about, oh, we're going to be data driven. That's great, but and I've used this in a number of different other presentations. ChatGPT, of course, created the image for me, but we have AI and it's here to stay. We're not going to get the genie back in the bottle. However, the issue is AI is now giving us so much data so quickly that people are easily overwhelmed, right? And so I want to just go back and take a look at a couple of examples of bad use of data in this case, with McNamara and his whiz kids at the Department of Defense during Lyndon Johnson's administration in the Vietnam War. Is McNamara brought all these people in who were going to use computers and things like that, including a Charles Hitch, who was the comptroller there, and data was fact. All right. So whatever the data said was absolutely what they were going to do. All right. And I think it's very key to talk about the fact that data alone does not make good decisions. All right. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, that's probably the key. So, they talked about they were going to use the active use of analytical staff to make top policy decisions. The problem is when they did that, they produced so much data and the analysis was so deep and so large that nobody could really challenge the conclusions because they couldn't even get their hands around the scope of the data. And that was when they were using punch cards. So think of the scope of that now with the concept of generative AI and analytical AI. A lot of data, but just data is not always enough. So you go to the other end of the extreme. Interesting enough, also a military example, deals with maybe my prior life, but never trust the data. George B. McClellan there on the right, the Napoleon of the West, he didn't trust anything. Pinkerton, who was on the left there, ultimately created the Pinkerton's detective agency, right? He would give McClellan Confederate troop strength and things like that. McClellan always thought he was wrong. So we have the other extreme right here, where you have McNamara data is always right. We have McClellan earlier, data is always wrong. Never trust it. And in either way we go, in today's world, you've got the firefighter drinking from the fire hose. And I know we've all heard that expression that, it's like drinking from a fire hose. Interesting enough, which is usually very refreshing. But you get so much data and you just get almost too much information. And when I was working on my dissertation a while ago, Richard Werman's book, Information Anxiety, talked about the fact that the New York Times in a single issue in 1989 included more information than the average peasant in medieval Europe saw in their entire lifetime. Right? If you've ever looked, for instance, at the early Encyclopedia Britannicas, and why I have a first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, one never knows, but it's 3 volumes. And it gives like 8 pages on how to make nails. We just continue to create more information. And the problem with that is it becomes much more difficult for us to continue to understand all that information. All of that data has to be funneled and looked at and considered in order to make good decisions. So the learning objectives for this session, we're really going to talk about identifying how to get through this process, right? And make sure we're aligning and doing what we're supposed to do. So holistic data-informed decision-making should be what our aim is, right? We don't want to just look at test scores. I'm sure if, this was more interactive and I could ask you for a show of hands, who believes that standardized test scores are the best way to measure student achievement, every hand would go up, right? Because that's a great data point. However much we use it for lots of stuff. And so we got to make better choices between just test scores, right? Actually, all the individuals matter, right? Teacher opinion does matter, right? So we want to take those experiences and use those to filter the data. And that's kind of what I mean by data-informed decision-making as opposed to data-driven decision-making. And we talk about the 5 steps there to kind of go through this. We're going to go through them one at a time, more or less, right? So in the first thing, we have to ask the right questions. Right? We can't just say, okay, why are our science scores low? We have to talk about what are the things that are struggling. We need to do that item analysis of the exam, whether it's the standardized test or however. How do we get that information? How do we build the right attitude? How do we make sure we have enough time for science in curriculum, right? Often at the elementary and middle school level, some of those things get pushed out in order to provide more reading and language arts instruction, potentially, or math, right? What are the strengths of our current science instructors? Are they doing a good job? Do we have the right curriculum in place? Not just why are our scores low? You have to look at these things in a much more multifaceted way than often we do, and especially in the soundbite piece of the world, either their board meetings or, in the political discourse these days, they all want the 30-second soundbite, and we need to talk about these things in much more detail. So for example, low writing scores. What are the specific things students are struggling with? And often, right now you're seeing kind of that pendulum switch back to the science of reading for folks, right? Because we had so many years of sort of whole language and different approaches, and they don't need phonics, and now, maybe we do. What are those opportunities? Where are we given the skills that students really need? How do we make sure that our assignments are authentic, right? Because if students have an authentic audience, they write more effectively, right? How do we engage them? How do we make sure they see that, hey, these are really skills I need? Though some would say in today's world, everything can be fit into 140 characters in text, and that's enough. But there is that need to teach students how to write, ultimately how to do academic writing, right, to be effective. So when you're looking at that, we're not just looking at those summative assessments at the end of the process, right? We have to look at the entire process. So in just that particular case, for instance, looking at formative assessments, right? What kind of classroom quizzes do we give? Exit tickets, collect that data on those days. One of the things that works really effectively is the more formative assessments you do within the classroom, especially when you can do them in real time so the teacher can immediately learn, hey, did yesterday's lesson hold, or do we need to stop and reinforce before I move forward? Much more effective than just taking the results of a quarterly exam or an end of unit test, something like that. So observational data, right? In observations and opinions and thoughts need to count in that data culture as well. So teacher opinions and what they're thinking needs to have weight, just like this test scores themselves do. Student self-assessments, right? How do they feel about it? Do they feel they're doing well on it? Do they understand? Parent feedback potentially on learning at home. Are they doing their homework? Attendance and behavior records, right? Students are more engaged, they're more likely to come to school, and actually they have fewer behavior issues if we're providing good instruction. So all of those things can potentially help us take a picture of holistically what's really going on in a classroom and answering a question, as opposed to just looking at a test score, right? So look for data limitations too, right? One of the big things with test scores is that in a lot of our standardized tests, right, where we put a lot of import on, there's nothing in it for the student. They have no skin in the game, right? So I just heard from a teacher who's actually a 3rd grade reading teacher that her students don't always take these things seriously. So if we're looking at that data, but there are limitations, and okay, maybe the students weren't properly motivated. When I was a superintendent and the stakes started to get higher on standardized tests, we used to take our high school students who actually met or exceeded standards down to a Cubs game, right? We had to motivate them to take the test seriously because there wasn't necessarily anything in it for them otherwise. So we had to figure out a way to put something in for them. Right? And so when you look at things, right, whether it's teacher observations, which obviously can be subjective, and looking like, are we going to use technology effectively? Does that impact grades? Those are correlations. They may not be causation. So just because, two things happen, don't necessarily mean, well, that means we have to do that again, so we get cause. There might be other evidence or other reasons. So we've got to look for those converging points of evidence and, triangulate. Okay, this is what we're looking for. This is what we're going to find. So, and I can't say this enough. This is that whole concept of human agency, right? We have to look for information from the data, but it doesn't dictate, it doesn't make the decisions for us. The teacher is the expert, and the teacher and the leadership team are the people who make final decisions about what we're going to provide for every student. In my perfect world, we would give every student an individual learning plan, just like Carl Washburn did with the Winona plan back in the 30s, and use all of those things. What can we do to make sure that students are going to get what they need and education is going to be successful? So, and it's a cycle, right? Data-informed decision-making is a change in culture, effectively. We're always going to look at data. We're going to go back and look at the data. I went to a Catholic high school, and Sister Ginny was our physiology instructor. And, she did an item analysis, and this was before she could do it easily on the computer, for every single exam she did, and looked and said, okay, I need to reteach this, or I need to change the way I teach it because, too many of you got that question wrong, right? And so instead of just saying, well, it's okay, we'll move on, it's always a matter of not just looking at data once, but going in regularly. You got to have that. It's an iterative process. You need to go back and do that ongoing cycle of improvement, always way. Take a look at the feedback. Was it effective? And sometimes in some cases, maybe it wasn't, and we'll need to go back again. So for instance, one example, let me go back there for a second. One example was we went to a new earth science curriculum because the state tests were for science at the time were very heavily into earth science, and we didn't have an earth science course necessarily. And so students were not doing well. We added an earth science course, made it a freshman course for students so they would be more successful on the state exams, but students were doing particularly poorly in the course, right? It required us to hire some extra science teachers, and I'm like, well, okay, why are we going to continue to do this if 70% of the students are failing the class? It doesn't even make sense to potentially wait and see. And we ended up going through things, looking at how to change the test. In part, they did a final exam that was like 250 questions. Students had about 90 minutes to take it, which is way too much. We culled it down. We were able to, clean that up. And so students weren't really failing. They weren't not gathering the information. We just had a bad test. And so when we cleaned that up, we were able to then be more effective. So, and again, all data needs to be looked at holistically, right? We have to ask the right questions, gather those diverse data, many data points, analyze it thoughtfully, allow human agency on top of it, right? We take our own professional wisdom and create those optimal learning opportunities by using that data, but not just saying, well, the data says so we have to do that. Professional wisdom and human agency definitely have a piece on this. Right? So think about, all right, if I got a curriculum issue or an administrative issue, what's the data I need? And the more types of data you can gather, the more robust whatever decision you're going to make is potentially going to be. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So it is an example, going back to the McNamara example at the beginning of the presentation. James Stockdale, who ended up being one of the longer serving naval aviators who was shot down over Vietnam, he was right there at the beginning of the war and was looking around and didn't see the issues that, McNamara's data was showing. It's like, I don't see that. The people on the ground, you have to take the data and then go show it to the people actually working in the environment on the ground and say, hey, what's going on? Right? And no different from a situation when you have teachers who get a class that theoretically that group of students should all work well together, but there's something that just, creates a bad environment when you get a certain group of students who all on their own are perfectly fine, but you just get a mix that becomes ineffective and doesn't allow for good classroom management. That happens from time to time, even though the teachers are thinking, okay, that'll be a good makeup of a class. Same concept. Data alone does not give you the answer. And so the next thing is making sure you're collecting the correct data. All right. And so you have to not only collect the data, it's got to be the correct data, and it has to answer the right questions. Right. And so you have to put everything together here and sort of make sure that those questions are being aligned to your strategic goals and objectives, right? And that there is that clear analysis path and reporting mechanisms. And as I've already mentioned, that you have to foster that culture where we're going to use data effectively. We're not going to just say we're going to use it. We expect people to really use data for decisions, right? And so the first just piece of alignment, right? We might collect a lot of data about student technology use, but where is that data being used? What are we doing effectively to say this is how we're going to use it, or this is what's going on? Every piece of data we collect should be aligned to our educational goals. For instance, when I was a superintendent, I asked our testing coordinator to give us give the cabinet a list of all the tests that we take because of state standardized testing and all those things. Students were wildly over tested. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't testing students for things that we didn't need to be. Or, were there two tests that were duplicative that we could then replace one? Well, it ends up we gave every student in second grade the COGAT test, and nobody could identify where we use that data. Like occasionally a school psychologist might use it for some testing, but generally speaking, we gave the test just because we always had, but nobody used that data. And so that's an example of making sure as you're collecting data, you're collecting the correct data. And you're not going back and gathering stuff that you don't really need. So in alignment, very straightforward here, right? Make sure that all of your goals align to the district's vision and goals, right? And I would argue even further as you go down, administrative goals should all align with, the district's vision and their goals. Same thing with individual teacher learning outcomes. They should all align back to the district's vision and goals so that we're all moving in the same direction. Right? So you might have a district goal to increase graduation rates, right? So how are you going to then set up, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that happens? What resources and supports do you need? I've always said some of the most effective schools are schools that make it hard to fail, right? They put enough support resources and safety nets in place that it's easier for a student to just do the work and pass the course than it is to actually fail. Because, even at the university level as well as at the high school level, if a student is struggling, there should be some sort of academic warning, and then somebody's going to reach out from, counseling or student services and reach out to that student and say, hey, what's going on? And that's really important. When I was first a principal, I actually had the guidance folks pull a list of all of the students who were failing every class. And I actually called there were about 15 in a high school of about 2,500 students. I actually called each one of them into my office and just talked to them about, hey, what's going on? in most cases, they just didn't think anybody was paying attention. And once they realized somebody was paying attention, all of those students passed at semester, except for two. One ended up becoming a mom, and one ended up becoming a inmate in a ward of the state. But everybody else passed the courses. So you use that data, you collect and say, hey, let's see how people are doing, right? Similarly, if teachers, if you want to be successful, right, pull a list of all the students before the progress reports go out and look at students who might be getting a D or an F and reach out to parents and say, hey, just want you to know, here's what might be happening, right? And so what can you do to make sure that we align things and then put resources in place that can help be effective? We're talking about, key goals. So if we look at, the goal from the previous page about graduation rates, we start to look at, okay, what student subgroups have low graduation rates? Are there common factors contributing to the low graduation rates? And what potential interventions will help? All right. So how can we collect data and look at some examples? So same thing, where are we gathering that data? And there are tons of different things we can use, right? I think we underutilize formative assessments in a lot of cases. I know of one PhD program that actually has everybody do a writing assignment in their first course, and then actually gives those writing assignments to a writing tutor from their writing lab, who then goes through and provides real detailed feedback to the student as far as, okay, these are things you can potentially do, and might even recommend, some additional tutoring resources for them to make sure they get caught up, right? And those early formative assessments in a lot of ways can really work effectively, right? Teacher observations, both of the teacher and how things are going in the classroom, as well as teacher observations of students, can be particularly helpful for us to make sure that we're getting all the right data. And when I was superintendent, I used to spend a lot of time, obviously, having to defend test scores, because at least in Illinois at the time, it didn't matter how well you were doing, your high school test scores were not going to be good. And so I would always put together, a slide when I did my annual State of the District presentation for the Chamber of Commerce on potential data sources, and I would come up with about 30 different things. For purposes here, we're not going to have that many, obviously, but you get the concept that we can look at those formative assessments beyond just standardized test scores. We could look at advanced placement scores or PSOE success rates, behavior records, right? Bullying rates. Are we reducing the number of bullying incidents? How is behavior overall? One thing that I always think is not used that should be is extracurricular activity. One of my goals for principals always was to increase the number of students in extracurricular activities, because there's a fair amount of research that will tell you that students who are engaged in extracurricular activities will be more effective within the scope of the regular academic program, right? And because they see more engagement, there's a reason for them to come and be excited to school, those extracurricular things. And even things simple like that, everybody knew that was a goal that would drive down. Music department chair got the goal to get more students involved in, musicals and plays. And they did. They were able to create better groups, they choose plays that had larger numbers in it, specifically so we could have more students involved. You do something like Beauty and the Beast, and you can have as many dancing napkins, forks and spoons as you need, so that everybody who wants to be in the play can be, right? And so you create that opportunity, get students more excited about being in school. It makes better, engagement for them, both with their peers that they're in events with, but also with the coaching and sponsorship staff beyond their regular classroom teachers. It's another place to potentially find a hook for a student. And so those are definitely ways to do it. Special ed data, I think, is important. I do wish we had an individual learning plan basically for every student, and not just IEPs for those students with special needs. You can look at the tech usage statistics and figure out where you get those. One thing that I've used historically is that I would go in and into Canvas, the learning management system I used at the time, and gather as much assessment data as I could and student use data out. And then I would look for things like, for instance, uh, teaching online, we would give students a few days ahead of time before class started to actually go in, look at the class, decide if it was really for them, right? Students who went into that class ahead of time and went into the shell and looked, they had a much higher percentage at the end of the class than the students who didn't. And so I would always send out advising notes and articulate, hey, for example, ways to be successful, use that, review period before class actually starts, go in, look at the curriculum, look at the syllabus, read through materials, be aware so then you can kind of set up and pace how you're going to have to get your work done to figure out how to be successful in the class. Right? Same thing, some higher ed data points here, academic records, obviously, course evaluations and feedback. One thing I often do is give students a beginning of the course evaluation and ask them what they expect from the class, right? So we all make assumptions about what students want to learn or what students have to learn, but I would always ask them, what are their expectations for the class? And I would also ask them, give me, 3 things that I can do to help you be successful in the class. And, you get some pretty generic things, but one that always sticks out was the student who responded, provide me gentle feedback, right? Because we all have examples in our own academic careers where, somebody takes your paper and just rips it up. Old movie Cocktails with Tom Cruise came out about 1988, I think. He was in business classes, and the instructor was making fun out of everybody's assignments and giving them all back with F's and D's on them. That doesn't help the student, right? Similarly, just a number grade doesn't. So those students want good feedback. And so that's obviously something I can continue to do to improve graduation rates, publications and citations and things like that. You can take a look at that. How many scholarships are students getting? One thing I always loved to show as a superintendent was how many scholarships that senior class had gotten from each of the high schools, right? That they've gotten $3 million in scholarship money this year, for instance. And if you build that up, then you get people to look for more, and you get the counselors out there trying to figure out what other scholarships are out there and drive those numbers up, hopefully. So, and the bottom where there obviously is the online learning analytics, which, especially if you're teaching in an online class or using an LMS to support your class, is a great way to potentially get some data. I also want to talk a little bit about dark data, right? That concept of dark data is data that we collect, like those COGAT test scores from an earlier part of this presentation, but we don't really use. We just hold on to it. And there's a lot of places you can go and look for stuff, right? So in addition to student surveys, and a lot of students now, or a lot of campuses will do student surveys on mental health. How do you feel? Do you feel safe? Do you feel supported? Do you have an adult you can go and talk to, or an instructor you can go speak with, right? Gather that data and use it for larger discussions about how we can be more effective. Don't just use that, for the student mental health services. Use that more broadly across all your academic programs. How can we take this data and help make courses that are more effective? How can we do a better job of pacing our course assignments so that everything doesn't land for people at the same time, right? Facilities use, just looking at where people are studying. As I was walking in and out of meetings on campus yesterday, saw a couple of young ladies studying, and they were making a lot of note cards, which didn't send off the vibe that they were elementary ed folks. They were actually 2 nursing students, but they came and used one of the lounges in one of the education buildings because at this time of year, our seniors are all gone. They're out doing their student teaching and things. So it was a good, happy place for them to sit and study. Look at library usage statistics. What are we doing? How can we be more effective in not only providing materials, but also services? When do students need, library sources? And there's a lot of stuff that's there that we don't necessarily use effectively, even though we collect it. And I've mentioned now several times, the LMS analytics. I think there's a lot of good information there. We just need to make sure that we're using it. Okay. And then as an organization, you just have to have really good plans for how are you going to report this data, right? If you're going to increase graduation rates, how are you going to track those cohort rates? How are you going to make sure that you get the data you need so that you can make good decisions? And I would argue, if you look at the illustration there, it's just random. I think it's actually from Twitter. It's just a random screenshot of data analytics. But you create that data dashboard that you can look at that is very simple for people to go and say, okay, this is how we do that. In fact, when I was first moved to higher ed, a couple more senior professors came to me one day and said, hey, the dean just told us we need to have a data dashboard for each department. Do you know what that is? And so I said, yeah, well, this is what it is. But that concept of where are all those key performance indicators and track them so that you see trends in as close to real time as possible. One of the toughest things in education, of course, is finding real good leading indicators, right? The lagging indicators like graduation rate is good, but it's too late to impact it afterwards, right? So we have to go back and find those leading indicators. So what are good identifiers of students who are struggling who may be at risk of not graduating? Well, often that freshman year transition from 8th grade to 9th grade is a good place, right? Or first year students at the university level. So if students are struggling, how do we reach out? How do we get them the academic support resources they need so that we can help them become successful, so they can get the study skills training maybe that they need? But whatever those skills are, how do we gather that data and then use it and then report it effectively? And just that general culture of data use, right? We have to tell people, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to use it effectively, right? If data reveals disparities, then the data team needs to have to take a look at that. Okay, what changes can we make? We can't just say, oh, we're going to collect this data and yeah, there's a disparity. You have to go to the next step and actually use that in an actionable way. Right? It's always a question to my students now is, all right, it's great to collect the data, but how is what you're presenting, how is that actionable? What can policymakers or instructors do differently now that they have that data and they know what you know from a data standpoint? How is that going to affect instruction or policy? And then just this purposeful use of the data, aligning the data with the educational goals. We talked about that earlier. Ask those goal-driven questions. Who are the students who are not doing well for our graduation rate? What data do we need? Then analysis and reporting, and that culture of a data use. And I think it's important you're like, well, didn't he already say that? I did. But I'm repeating it because the purposeful data use is essential to building that culture that really talks about data use. And everybody knows, well, this is what I think. That's okay, but what's the data that supports that, right? Talking about like mixed method research, right? Data shouldn't all be quantitative or qualitative. I always tell my students, even if they're doing quantitative studies, it's never a bad idea to have a couple open-ended questions at the end that say, okay, what can you tell me about this or that, or what else should I know? Because you do get that information helps to paint a better picture of the quantitative data by itself, of getting that qualitative data as well. So we're talking about, promote equity and collaboration, right? Demystify the voices in the data interpretation. Look at data through an equity lens as well, right? Get collaborative data inquiry. Don't just say, well, here's the data and then walk away. Make sure the person who actually collects and analyzes the data is able to talk to the people who are supposed to implement change so they can fully understand the data, if that makes sense. All right. And then again, the voices in data interpretation. A wide range of stakeholders in the process. The more people you can involve, the better. When I was doing technology planning in the late 90s, early 2000s, I always made sure I found a couple people to be on those committees who were not technology users, right? They were excellent teachers. And then if I could convince them technology was useful to improve instruction, they would buy in. But you don't want to just get all the people who already think alike, right? Try to get those wide representations, not only by grade and subject, but by view and philosophy of education, right? There's some people who are very pragmatistic, right? We need to teach students what they need. We have other people who are perennialists. There are certain things in the world we just always need to know, right? And then I do suggest always when you review that survey to put those focus groups together. And one of the reasons is because those focus groups are another way first for everybody to learn, right? It creates and supports that culture of data use, but it also allows people to hear, like you'll hear people occasionally say in those kind of focus groups, well, the survey says that parents don't feel welcome in the school. Well, that's not true. We're very welcoming. Well, clearly you're not from their perspective. So you have to be able to look at that data through the eyes of the people who are sharing and not just say, well, that can't be right. Right? That same thing with the equity lens. What are those critical questions about why disparity exists? Are there systematic factors that must be at play? Are there other issues? Where you can disaggregate data and look at different types of students, do so and try to figure out, okay, what can we do to provide opportunities for those students? And I would argue, I do worry about when we disaggregate data only by like race or ethnicity. Socioeconomic factors often play a much bigger role than just race or ethnicity do. And so we need to look at those factors, you know, at the university level, look at our veteran students. How are we dealing with those students? Because they have some different needs for a lot of reasons, right? Figure out what those critical questions that need to be asked are, and then ask them again until you get answers. And get those teams together, get everybody working together. So there's that process that they can say, this is the data we want, here's how to use it. Again, observations are good as well as numbers and scores. You know, I had an issue once where a parent was very upset about some changes to the lunch program and that their child didn't have enough time to eat. I actually offered the school board members, I said, hey, because, you know, she of course went to the board and complained. I offered the board members, if any of them would like to come in and watch the lunch process, I was very happy to set that up. My board president, who at the time was sort of a larger man, emailed the best response I've ever gotten from any question from a school board member was he's going to say, I don't know if you haven't noticed, but I don't look at lunch as a spectator sport. Sorry, every time I think of that, I just have to share it. He was hilarious. He was a great board president. But, you know, use observation, go in and look, walk through classrooms. I would always ask my administrators to make sure they were in every classroom in their room before October 1st, every school year, so that, you know, they actually saw what was going on. So if they do get questions, they can say, well, I've been in that room and this is what I saw. Right? Make sure whatever you're going to use for data literacy in that shared vocabulary is shared in such a way everybody can understand that graph. Because the graph looks pretty, but it doesn't really tell you anything because there are no labels, etc. So people need to know what that vocabulary is and how to do it. And it can't be a one-time thing. You have to do it regularly. Same thing, linking to resources. So once you've got the data, use it effectively to say, this is how I'm going to change things. And these are policies that need to be changed because they're not effective or they're hindering student success. What can we do to change them? So here's sort of those, a summary, you know, build the collaborative and inclusive environment that people are going to use data, create that data culture, right? Make sure routines use data. We're going to look at the data, what we're going to not just talk about what we got concerns about enrollment. All right, let's see the data. What are the trends and how can we impact them? Use dark data we've already been collecting, we're not using effectively, and build data literacy throughout the entire organization. So just as one last example, you've been able to see me. Here is on the left is ChatGPT's portrait of me. I asked it based on, my interactions with it, give me an image. And he said I was someone deeply engaged in the field of education, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But, that image doesn't include anything about my height, my body mass, what I do, what ethnicity I am, et cetera. Maybe it made some assumptions from its data. I don't know. And then the same thing, one of my students, Jordan O'Connell, did the same thing. He asked the same question and got a slightly different picture. Actually, I think he looks older than I am, even though he's probably 30 years younger than I am. So you can't just use some data. Some data will give you an inaccurate portrait, right? So you have to look at all of the data that's available to get you the best image that you can.